Bye weeks and injuries are so hard to deal with this time of year. And then you have your surefire guys, your must-starts, like Barkley and Zeke. They just come out and they lay an egg at this point in the season. It's like ripping out your soul. It's enough to make a grown man cry. I mean, we tried. I can't. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully you guys are all doing well out there. Welcome to Week 11. The 11th week of fantasy football already. Absolutely crazy. And yeah, you heard it there in the opening. There were some big names that really disappointed this past week. We talked about Zeke and Barkley. We also had Marlon Mack and Todd Gurley. Jalen Samuels was supposed to do more. Mark Ingram didn't do a whole lot after Baltimore got a huge lead. Some big names that we were counting on that ended up being misses there for us in Week 10. So what do we do going forward here in Week 11? We have all the matchups, going to break down all the players here coming up in just 1 second. Just a reminder, though, don't pay too much attention to the name and what column they're in. There are so many variables with this information. Take the information we provide and use that to help make your decisions a little bit easier this weekend. That's the goal of this show, not trying to just tell you what to do, but help you make the right decision. So before we get into the Week 11 matchups, let's see how we did in Week 10. Despite all those big name players in Week 10 coming out and laying an egg, we still had an overall pretty solid week. 34 total running backs given a start or sit designation, 20 of which we got correct, for an accuracy percentage of 59%. Some of our biggest hits, Melvin Gordon. I've been continuing to bang this drum for the past couple weeks. Once Anthony Lynn took over play calling duties, I knew Melvin Gordon was about to have a strong second half. Damian Williams, arguably his best game of the year last week, had him as a start also. Nick Chubb. A lot of people were worried that, the return of Kareem Hunt was really going to hurt Nick Chubb. I was not. I am all about that Chubb life, and he continued to have a solid season. Aaron Jones started doing Aaron Jones things once again. A lot of people were worried 2 weeks ago when he struggled, came out and proved the naysayers wrong once again. And then Kalen Ballage. He saw the volume for the Miami Dolphins, and I had people tell me that I would regret having him as a sit, that he was a talented running back. Needless to say, I have not heard from any of those people this week because Kalen Ballage sucked. Some of our biggest misses, I know a lot of people have been looking forward to this point. Ronald Jones was a miss. I mean, it's hard to say he was a miss when he only had like 29 yards rushing, but he was finally involved in the passing game. It put him over the top. Joe Mixon took 30 carries, but he had a solid day once again. He was a miss for us. Tariq Cohen found the end zone. Peyton Barber, look at that, both Tampa Bay running backs on the list. That is a surprise. And then David Montgomery, not so much his fault. I don't know what's going on with Coach Matt Nagy, the play calling. We'll get into that a little bit later, but David Montgomery was a miss for us last week, had him as a start, and he underperformed also. But now that we're heading into Week 11, let's take a look at some of these matchups and find out who should we start and sit this week. Steelers and Browns up next, and it sounds like James Conner is going to be back for the Pittsburgh Steelers and just in time. What we thought was going to be the savior, the PPR savior, and Jalen Samuels wasn't last week. Just 2 weeks ago, he had 13 receptions. Expected something similar, maybe a little bit less this past week. He went out and had 3 receptions and totally killed your fantasy lineup. Now, Cleveland allows right around 19 fantasy points per game. That's 14th in the NFL. A bend but not break style run defense there for the Cleveland Browns. Conner seems to be fully healthy and ready to go. In the last 2 games that he's played, he's averaged 23 plus touches in those games and has 5 total touchdowns over his last 5 games played. If he's in the lineup, if he's playing for the Steelers, he's going to be involved both on the ground and through the air and should be in your lineup, which means we're going to sit Jalen Samuels. Now, for the Cleveland Browns, what everybody wants to talk about, Nick Chubb still is a must-start every single week running back, regardless of matchup. Chubb saw 22 touches last week to Kareem Hunt's 11. Out of those 11 touches for Kareem Hunt, 7 of them were for receptions and only 44 total yards. The run game in Cleveland has been the one constant all year long. It's been the one thing that they've really succeeded at all season. They need to utilize it more and more going forward, and Nick Chubb is the heart of the run game. He has 100-plus yards rushing 4 out of the last 6 games, double-digit fantasy points in every single game this year, and has had 20-plus carries 6 out of the last 7 weeks. Now, Pittsburgh, it's a tough run defense. They only allow 14 fantasy points per game. That's 6th best in the NFL. But Chubb right now, he's already over 1,000 total yards and is running back 6 in fantasy football. I'll roll Chubb out every single week. As for Kareem Hunt, He's more of a deep league flex, especially in PPR leagues. His volume may not be there on a weekly basis to make him a consistent, weekly flex start. However, deeper leagues, you're somebody who's hurting with a lot of injuries or bye weeks, then Kareem Hunt has some value. But if you have other options, I'm going to avoid Kareem Hunt at least for the next week or two. Falcons and Panthers up now, and it sounds like we're going to be without Devonta Freeman here this week. Injured himself last week with a foot injury, and he could miss a couple weeks. Horrible timing for Devonta Freeman owners. I mean, he's been a solid running back too most of the year, and now he misses the matchup against the Carolina Panthers, who give up almost 25 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Horrible timing. So no Devonta Freeman. We already know there's no Ito Smith. Insert Brian Hill. You may not even know who he is. You may have just grabbed him up off your waiver wire, and he may go directly into your starting lineup. The volume will be there, and the matchup is great. He is an easy flex play for me here this week, especially with the bye weeks and the injuries that a lot of people are dealing with. For the Panthers, it's Christian McCaffrey. He hasn't had less than 20 fantasy points in a half-point PPR scoring since week 2. Touchdowns in 8 of his 9 games played, and Atlanta gives up on average almost 19 fantasy points per game. I'd say once again, he's a pretty safe start. Cowboys and Lions up next, and a lot of people are pissed with Ezekiel Elliott here lately. Now, yeah, he had a bad week 10, but it went as far as on Twitter this week, and I was seeing people complaining about his season-long production. That I really don't understand. Yeah, this past week, 20 carries for only 47 yards, no touchdowns, absolutely horrible. But overall, he's having a pretty solid year. Not having, a huge year, but a solid year right now. He's currently running back 8 in fantasy football for half-point PPR formats. He's just under 1,000 total yards and averaging about 100 total yards per game. The part that's really hurting his fantasy upside right now is his lack of involvement in the passing game. He only has 2 receptions combined over the last 2 weeks. This is an area of Zeke's game which in the beginning of the season, end of last year, he really thrived in and really gave you that huge floor on a weekly basis. That's what's not there. A slight decrease in touchdowns. You have yourself a solid running back, just not those huge numbers that you're waiting for. However, great matchup this week going up against the Lions, who allowed 25.2 fantasy points per game. Second most in the NFL. Possible Zeke breakout, bounce back, whatever you want to call it here in week 11. It's possible. He's an obvious must start. Now, for Detroit, I didn't really like this backfield when Ty Johnson was 100% healthy. And whether he plays or not, it's kind of debatable, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, I really don't like this backfield without him. There's a chance that they sign an aging vet at some point. Maybe Mike Brown or Jay Ajayi gets some run at some point here in this backfield. Or do they just rely solely on J.D. McKissick? Dallas, they only allow 18.9 fantasy points per game, a middle-of-the-pack run defense. Now, in deeper leagues, if you're struggling and looking for a flex play, especially in PPR leagues, J.D. McKissick has some value. But if I have my choice as of right now, I'm avoiding anybody in the backfield for the Detroit Lions. Jags and Colts up next. Leonard Fournette back off the bye week and back into your starting lineups here once again in Week 11. We know the return of Nick Foles is here. He's back under center for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And this is somewhat of a difficult matchup for Leonard Fournette, but his involvement in the passing game is something that just gives him that safe floor on a weekly basis. He sees 6+ targets a game in 7 of the 9 games that he's played in. Right now, he's number 2 in the NFL in red zone touches with 39, and number 2 in the NFL in yards created at 397. Now, he's doing all of this while seeing the 3rd most stacked boxes amongst all NFL running backs. Indianapolis only allows 14.9 fantasy points per game. Still kind of a tough matchup, but it's Leonard Fournette, and that volume makes him a weekly must-start here at this point. Now, for the Colts, Mac is kind of disappointed as of late, right? He's had single-digit fantasy production 3 out of the last 4 games, 2 receptions over his last 3 weeks combined. Those are not the type of numbers that are going to, make you happy to start Marlon Mack. Nyheim Hines, he's starting to get a little bit more and more involved in this passing game for the Indianapolis Colts, and Jacksonville's allowed 18.8 fantasy points per game. Now, with the bye weeks and the injuries that you're still dealing with, I highly doubt you have better options than Marlon Mack. You throw him in your lineup as a running back 2, you cross your fingers, you hope for the best, and technically, you really hope that Jacoby Brissett comes back, because that's where Marlon Mack saw his best games. Something to pay attention to here throughout the week, but Marlon Mack still in the start column. Bills and Dolphins up next, and can the Buffalo Bills please give some consistent touches to Devin Singletary on a weekly basis? I mean, 2 weeks ago, this kid saw 23 touches and had a huge game. Last week, 11 touches. Come on, we got to do a better job getting the ball in this guy's hands. He's averaging 6.5 yards per carry right now, good enough for number 1 in the NFL, and he's seen less than 7 defenders in the box. He's going to get the opportunity to make the big play, which he's already doing this year. In the 6 games he's played, he's had 6 breakaway runs. Those are runs over 15 yards. The kid has a lot of talent, and now he has a great matchup going up against Miami, who allows right around 23 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, 5th most in the NFL. Frank Gore is kind of taking a back seat in this backfield, but they need to get the ball more to Devin Singletary. I'm looking for it this week. He's a start in Week 11. Now, for Miami, you have Kalen Ballage, if you care. More than likely, you probably not. I mean, I had people tell me last week that this kid has talent. He's a great runner. All he needed was an opportunity. I disagreed then, and I disagree now. I mean, the guy saw 20 carries that he turned into 43 yards. For the year, averaging 2.1 yards per carry, which is right around his, career average. Is a decent matchup for him, but I have to imagine you have better options than Kalen Ballage, who at this point is goal line touchdown dependent. That's the only way he sees a decent game. You're reliant on the Dolphins getting to the 1-yard line. It doesn't happen a whole lot anyway. I'm going to sit Kalen Ballage. I'd rather take my chances elsewhere. Houston and Baltimore up next, and man, did I love Mark Ingram last week against the Bengals. And things went according to plan. Baltimore got out to a lead. They relied on the run. The problem is they got out to such a big lead so quickly, they didn't really need Mark Ingram for the majority of that game. At least he had a touchdown there to somewhat salvage the day for his fantasy owners. But we know Baltimore is going to run a lot, and we know that touchdown upside is going to be there weekly for Mark Ingram. Solid running back, too, going up against a Houston team that allows right around 16 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But don't forget, no more J.J. Watt there. Only makes things easier for one Mark Ingram. So he's going to be a start here once again. Now, it's a mess in Houston. You have Carlos Hyde and Duke Johnson coming off of their bye week, where they both had their best game of the year 2 weeks ago. So are we going to see more of a split going forward in Houston? There's no passing work being involved with Carlos Hyde and very little carries on the ground to Duke Johnson. Right now, the Baltimore run defense is playing decent, and they're going to be playing at home, coming off a stellar couple of weeks here where the Ravens are looking like Super Bowl contenders right now. Lamar Jackson playing absolutely crazy, and Baltimore allows 17.8 fantasy points per game. But the split between these two really has them limiting each other's upside. We don't know who's going to touch the ball on a weekly basis, which makes them very touchdown dependent. If they don't score, they hurt you. Depending on what, format you play in, standard leagues, you're more Carlos Hyde. PPR leagues, you're more Duke Johnson. But they are deep league flex plays at best right now. Until we can really figure out going forward what kind of split these guys see and how many touches on a weekly basis they're going to get. Until then, though, I prefer to avoid both. Broncos and Vikings up now, and Dalvin Cook remains to be one of my top preseason calls here in 2019. I made a video just on Dalvin Cook telling you why he was a must-have here in 2019, and he is not disappointed whatsoever. He's matchup proof and will continue to rack up points in bunches for the Minnesota Vikings. He's an obvious must-start. But I'm not as excited for the Denver backfield. I mean, going into the bye week, Phillip Lindsay had a couple really good games. 5 of 7 games in double digits, 3 touchdowns over his last 5 games. Royce Freeman, not quite as flashy, more of a solid low-end RB2 flex play at best on a weekly basis. But this Minnesota run defense is really above average. Over the last 5 weeks, there's only been one running back to get over 76 rushing yards against them. It was Damian Williams, and it took a 91-yard touchdown play to get it. This is not a defense that you can run easily against. Last week, they just shut down Zeke Elliott and only allowed 47 rushing yards to Zeke and the Dallas Cowboys. Right now, Minnesota 5th best in the NFL, giving up on average only 14.2 fantasy points per game. I'm avoiding both of these guys unless I have no better options. If I have to choose one, I'm rolling the dice on Phillip Lindsay and hoping for a big play. Jets and Redskins up now, and a lot of people underwhelmed with the performance of Le'Veon Bell, but don't forget, it doesn't help that he's not 100% healthy either. Add that to the fact that Sam Darnold missed games with mono, a poor offense overall for the Jets, injuries all over the field, and even despite all of that, Le'Veon Bell is still currently running back 13 in half-point PPR formats just outside of the RB1 tier. Washington allows 21.3 fantasy points per game, 8th most in the NFL. Monitor the practice reports. Bell may be one of these guys here remainder of the year that doesn't practice a whole lot earlier in the week, comes out, plays on the weekend, gets you between 15 and 20 touches, and is a solid performer. Pay attention to it, though, because if he's starting, he's in your lineup. Now, it's not a bad matchup either for the Redskins going up against the Jets, who allow 16.8 fantasy points per game, but Darius Geis should return this week, and they had the bye week to kind of get him up to speed. AP was a healthy scratch the last time that Darius Geis played. Now, obviously, things have changed since then. Adrian Peterson was running fairly well before his bye week, but what type of split do we see between Adrian Peterson and Darius Geis? Darius Geis is the more dynamic running back, the bigger playmaker in this offense. He's just struggled with injuries. I highly doubt they throw him in there in his first game back and give him a full workload. It's going to be a split with Adrian Peterson, and until we can see what that split is, more than likely, I'd rather wait a week and find out and deal with this backfield in Week 12. Saints and Bucks up next, and I guess the Ronald Jones breakout happened in Week 10, but I've been saying all season long, this guy is not an option in your fantasy lineup until he became involved in the passing game. That's what's really going to separate him from some of these other guys that you may have on your bench. I mean, look at last week's numbers. He had a whole 29 yards rushing. That's not where he's going to get you those fantasy points. However, he added in this week 8 receptions for 77 yards. Coming into the game last week, he'd had 8 receptions all year long. That's a big difference, but it's going to be short-lived. Right now, New Orleans only allows 11.8 fantasy points per game, 4th best in the NFL. Barber, he's still involved. He's still getting touches. Dare Ogunbala Walla Walla, or however you say it, he's going to get you right around 3 to 4 targets a week on a weekly basis. They're still all involved in this backfield. Yes, Ronald Jones may be the leader in touches, but if he doesn't see those reception numbers on a weekly basis, he's going to put up poor performances. That's just the type of running back that he is. Now, going into Week 11, I'm not going to hop on the overreaction train here of Ronald Jones, and I'm going to sit him here once again in a tough matchup going up against the Saints. Now, for the Saints, of course, you're going to start Alvin Kamara. A little bit quiet in his return last week, but remember, coming back from injury, they weren't really quick to just throw him out there, give him the ball 20 to 25 times, and risk re-injuring himself. They need him down the stretch here of the rest of the season, but this is a difficult matchup for him too. Tampa Bay, they're number 2 against opposing running backs, giving up on average only 10.9 fantasy points per game. He's going to be involved in the passing game, though, and that's really where Tampa Bay struggles to contain opposing running backs. If you have Alvin Kamara, you're going to start him here once again in Week 11. Cardinals and 49ers up now, and talk about a muddled mess in the Arizona backfield. I mean, David Johnson looks slow. Kenyon Drake splitting carries with him. We don't know when Chase Edmonds is going to come back and what the backfield will look like then. I mean, what do we do going forward? Don't forget that it was just a couple weeks ago, Kenyon Drake's first game as an Arizona Cardinal went up against this San Francisco run defense and put up 162 total yards. This is the guy who needs to be involved in this backfield. However, if both of these guys, Kenyon Drake and David Johnson, start this week, I'm going to sit David Johnson, and I'll flex Kenyon Drake at best. He is the most explosive runner in this backfield right now, and he's who belongs, getting these touches on a weekly basis. Now, for the San Francisco 49ers, could be somewhat interesting over here also. Matt Breida getting a second opinion on his ankle injury. Does he play? He's played with injuries before. In fact, he seems like he's always playing with injuries. Can we trust him, though? If he's limited, if he sits, how much more volume does Tevin Coleman get? Obviously, Tevin Coleman's going to be a start if Matt Breida sits. If Breida plays, however, Tevin Coleman kind of flirts with like a flex play at best. They've kind of been sputtering at times in San Francisco. The running game has been inconsistent here as of late, but Tevin Coleman with those added touches could be a pleasant surprise here in Week 11. Monitor those practice reports. Let's find out how involved Matt Breida is going to be, because if he sits, we're firing up Tevin Coleman without any doubt. Bengals and Raiders up next in 30. Joe Mixon had 30 carries in Week 10. I mean, heck, his previous 3 games this season, he had a combined 35 carries and then had 30 alone in Week 10. I mean, is that something we could see again to take some pressure off rookie quarterback Ryan Finley? Yeah, it is. Gio Bernard's been injured. Does that mean that Joe Mixon sees even more work in the passing game? Yeah, possibly. Right now, the Raiders give up just under 20 fantasy points per game, which is 12th most in the NFL. I mean, Joe Mixon as a safety valve with that type of usage, I'll throw him into the starting lineup here this week. Going against the Oakland Raiders, the first time in the black hole for Ryan Finley. He's going to need to check down early and often to Joe Mixon. Definitely going to start him. Now for the Raiders, I'm going to start Josh Jacobs also. Last week, saw a season high in targets with 5. That gives me a chubby, because I've been saying all year long, if this dude could get involved in the passing game, his fantasy production could go to a whole nother level. Right now, the Bengals allow on average 24 fantasy points per game, 4th most in the NFL. I'm firing up Josh Jacobs. Patriots and Eagles up now, 2 tough run defenses, and Sony Michel's been a huge letdown for a lot of people here in 2019. Right now, only averaging 3.3 yards per carry. He does have touchdowns in 4 out of his 9 games played, but he's splitting carries with Rex Burkhead and James White. James White is the safer option in my opinion. He has double-digit fantasy production 7 out of 9 games and saw a season high in carries back in Week 9 before the bye week. Plus, he's less affected by this Philadelphia run defense. Right now, this defense only allows 15 fantasy points per game, 8th best in the NFL. I mean, this isn't an easy matchup, but James White as a safety valve, as a checkdown in PPR leagues, I like a lot more than Sony Michel here this week. Now, for Philadelphia, it's not that easy of a matchup either. The Patriots only allow on average 10.5 fantasy points per game. That's number 1 in the NFL. Miles Sanders, he's somewhat of a touchdown-dependent running back, really reliant on the big plays in the passing game. But where New England has been vulnerable as of late, at least before the bye week, has been on the ground. That's where teams have really been able to take advantage of the New England Patriots. It's how the Baltimore Ravens beat them. They beat them on the ground, and with Jordan Howard, that could be how the Philadelphia Eagles attack them this week. Jordan Howard is a risk going up against a solid run D of the New England Patriots. However, with all the bye weeks and injuries, I'm willing to take that risk, and I'm going to start Jordan Howard in Week 11. Bears and Rams up now, and we finally had a great opportunity for David Montgomery. Last week, he was touching the ball. He's involved in the passing game. Great matchup for him last week. And then Week 10 happened, and what the fuck, Matt Nagy? I just don't understand this offense. Tariq Cohen getting a little bit more involved now. I mean, David Montgomery had seen at least 1 target every single game this year until Week 10, where he saw 0 targets. I just don't understand this offense, and this risk for David Montgomery is making it really hard for me to even want to start him on a weekly basis. Right now, the Rams give up just over 17 fantasy points per game, so it's not a horrible matchup, but I have no trust in this offense as a whole, in the play calling, or David Montgomery really at this point. Not talent-wise, not the kid's fault, the offense as a whole. I just don't know if I like this, especially with the likes of Aaron Donald on the opposite side of the field. There's huge risk there. I highly doubt you have better choices here in this week with injuries and bye weeks, but as a flex play at best with huge risk, I'll start David Montgomery. On the Rams side of things, there's really no sense of urgency at all. I mean, they're still 3 games back with 7 to play this year. They need to make a run if they want to get into the playoffs. And Gurley was running great last week, had 12 carries for 73 yards. The problem is he's only had 1 reception over his last 3 games combined. If they want to make a run at the playoffs, they need to do it now, and they need to rely on their studs. What I'm worried about is if the Rams get mathematically eliminated in that division that's already uber competitive, maybe they rest Todd Gurley a little bit more, and he hurts us down the stretch here of our fantasy football season. We need the Rams to keep winning games. We need them to do it this week against the Bears in a great matchup because they allow over 19 fantasy points per game. Todd Gurley back in the start column. Chiefs and Chargers up next in Viva la Mexico. That's right, they're going to be in Mexico City for Monday Night Football, and Anthony Lynn calling the plays for the Chargers means I love Melvin Gordon once again this week. He now has back-to-back games with 100-plus total yards and has 3 total touchdowns over his last 2 games. The Chiefs allow over 25 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, the most in the NFL. Love some Melvin Gordon, but Austin Eckler also has some flex appeal here for Week 11. If the Chiefs can move the ball down the field and score points, they're going to be forced to throw more in LA. If that's the case, Austin Eckler has some sneaky flex play upside like him there again in Week 11. Now for Kansas City, we talked about it last week with Damian Williams. He has really seemed to take a stranglehold on this backfield. LaShawn McCoy was punished for fumbles earlier in the season. Damian Williams has made the most of it, and I expect him to do that here again. Had 24 total touches and 109 total yards last week. And now the Chargers allow 21.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, which is 7th most in the NFL. With Mahomes back under center, it's going to draw defenders outside of the box, and Damian Williams once again has that opportunity to do kind of what we saw him do at the end of 2018, really take this offense by storm. If they can stay healthy, I like Damian Williams down the stretch here in Week 11. All right, those are all my starts and sits here for Week 11 fantasy football for the running back position. Let me know what you think down below. Just a quick reminder, remember, we had a challenge out there to Headliner Nation. You guys wanted more content, wanted more information. You want more things from this channel, and we want to give it to you. The only way we can do that is by Patreon. There's a link down below in the description, and for only $1 a month, if we can get 10,000 patrons there to sign up on Patreon, Kyle, myself, and Ryan will all get tattoos on our right butt cheeks that say sayings here of the show. Kyle's will be Tight End Whisperer, I'll be Let It Flow, and Ryan's will be Show Me the Money. Now, if you really want to see that happen, head to the link down below in the description. All it takes is $1 per month, and we will live stream or record the whole thing once it happens. It's a challenge out there. I'm kind of hoping it doesn't happen, but I'm kind of hoping it does. It'll be a lot of fun. Really appreciate the support. Hopefully you guys have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you later.